Welcome to the first paper session on analysis. So we have three papers. Mattias Sköld, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing, on the notation of sound for composition and transcription, an adaptation of Lasse Thoresen's spectromorphological analysis. So please, you can take over.
Thank you. So hello, everyone. It's nice to be back. First, I'd like to thank the organizers for making this conference possible. I am Mattias Sköld, and I'm a senior lecturer in composition at the Royal College of Music in Stockholm. But I'm also doing a PhD at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm with a focus on interactive notation and algorithmic composition. And I'm here to present my work with sound notation adapted from Thoresen's spectromorphological analysis. And I should say also, it's really nice to be back after presenting the first steps of this project at TENOR 18 in Montreal. Schaffer's famous type of morphology was adapted by Thoresen into a notation system for analysis of music as heard. And we can see in the adaptation how Schaffer's facture and mass became energy, articulation, and sound spectrum, while duration became an aspect of the graphical score. And by the way, both tables, of course, show only selected categories for the sake of comparison. And what most clearly defines my adaptation of Thoresen's analysis is the placement of symbols over a spectrum staff system. It is about taking symbols originally related to listening and connecting them to specific, measurable, and identifiable values. So moving along, I should say I still teach, use, and recommend Thoresen's analysis theory and notation. My adapted notation is simply meant for other uses, such as composition and transcription. The top example here is Thoresen's own analysis, or part of it, of an Åke Parmerud work from his and Andreas Hedman's organized sound article. And the bottom example is from my sonology teaching, so it's not the same music. So Schaffer discusses in the first half of his treatise how specifically timbre as a musical parameter is missing in traditional notation and traditional music theory. But the way I see it, traditional notation still provides good tools for making sense of pitch, harmony, and rhythm, while electroacoustic music analysis has much better theory for making sense of timbre and timbral changes. And in order to give timbre and pitch equal importance, I believe both staff notation and a frequency axis are necessary, at least if we want to relate it to the notation to musical practice. So in my adaptation, Thoresen's core sound spectrum categories are rationalized and placed over a spectrum staff. But pitch sounds are still pitched, dystonic sounds, which have inharmonic spectra, have the same meaning here. Complex sounds, which are unpitched, have the same meaning as well, though the information indicated by Thoresen's empty note heads, as you see on the left, which have to do with specific timbral characteristics of these categories, the information is notated in other ways. And then we have spectral width. So instead of spectral brightness, as you can see on the left, we have spectral width, meaning the significant frequency range of the sound object. The significant frequency range being, as it's defined at least for now, it's the range of loudest partials, starting from the lowest partial at -10 dB and ending with the highest at -10 dB. Yeah, it's perhaps more telling from the image from Logic's graphic equalizer. So it's the loudest range of spectral energy. So yes, we have the spectral width, which is accompanied by the spectral centroid, which is the center frequency of a sound's spectral energy. So you can see together these two, the width and centroid, they sort of are similar to the indicator that Thoresen uses, but he uses it in relative terms. And also, as you can see, there is no indicator for centroid for the complex sound, the unpitched sound, because that symbol is already positioned at the place of the centroid frequency. I introduced spectral density as the equivalent of spectrum saturation. And you can see the range of symbols below, which were derived from the saturation or noise indicators on the left. And the filled block represents maximum spectral density, which is noise. And if everything goes according to plan, I will be able to play these very simple sounds. Can perhaps even recognize them. And we can also compare to the sonogram, the logarithmic sonogram, because the logarithmic sonogram obviously is going to match the scale of the stuff better. And finally, okay, not brilliant music yet, but there's also the possibility of spectrum reference. Because while spectral width, centroid, and density are essential for indicating timbre changes in a composition, a spectrum reference can be more efficient for indicating a particular recognizable timbre. Though I will naturally not have time to go into all the details in the system today. Moving on to dynamics and energy articulation, I introduce amplitude envelopes placed below the sound object, which can have any shape. And still looking at the same example, I have granularity, which is almost identical to Thoresen's notation, but he calls it granular gate from Schaffer's allure, or I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but anyway. Difference is the introduction of separate grains, which replaces the category of iterative sounds, which is in Schaffer and Thoresen, but which I found that my students were always a bit confused as to the differences between iterative sounds and granular sounds. So I consider iterative sounds as sort of a subcategory of granularity. And for dynamics, like Thoresen, I relied to a certain degree on relative dynamics, traditional dynamics, but also value variation curves, like more elaborate amplitude envelopes. And moving on to rhythm. After running tests with students a few years now, I settled on this option of separate notation for rhythm with the focus on onsets, because that's where traditional rhythm notation tends to shine, while the extension lines for the main symbols are for duration as well as pitch contour. In early prototypes, probably what I showed in 2018, I had stems and beams in the spectral notation, and it was a mess. So this becomes more clear. So those of you who are familiar with electroacoustic music probably recognize that this little short example was from Stockhausen's Kontakte. Then there's spatialization, not part of the adaptation though. Movement can be notated using symbols similar to the graphical user interfaces used in 3D panning software. And this was of course also inspired by the ICST spatialization symbolic music notation, which is represented at tenor, as well as the spat scene for notation and control of spat in open music. It's also been here in tenor, I believe. Though if you have sound in orbit, going round and round, I would notate that as a movement as articulation rather than as positional changes. And there's also symbols for reverbs being associated with particular sounds. And then finally moving on to a few sort of uses of this so far. I have since, for 5 years now actually, used this notation in teaching, particularly in the course in sonology for composition students that all composition students take in Stockholm. And the students have helped me immensely in finding weak spots in the design and use of the notation. So what you see here is a sonology assignment where the students were asked to interpret this score using their own recorded acoustic sounds. And they had not heard the original sound sketch that this was actually transcribed from, which I've made just for the sake of the assignment. So this is what the original sound sketch sounds like that I had made first. And yes, as you can hear, a variety of timbres and combinations of stuff. And you can also see that this was before implementing those perhaps more clear amplitude envelope symbols, which shows in the results. So this is an overlaying of all students' assignments, not having heard the original sound, by the way, they only got the score. So I was fairly happy with it, but as you could also hear, it was differences, particularly in the amplitude, in the energy articulation of the sounds. I've also used the notation for transcribing some classic, let's say, excerpts from classic electroacoustic pieces. So this was, as you saw a bit earlier in this presentation, this is from the tape part of Stockhausen's Kontakte. Extra interesting for me, considering that there is this original, more intuitive notation in the score for the percussionist and pianist to follow the tape part. So what I will play now, though, is not then the Stockhausen original, but what one of my students made from only looking at the score, actually not knowing that it was from an electroacoustic piece. So I've also had composition students write music with this notation, either for parts of the composition or for the whole pieces, as in this case. I only will have time to show a little of it, but anyway, this is from a piece by Simon Söderberg, one of our composition students in the electroacoustic music, and he wrote this piece for live electronics ensemble and scoring, I think, at like 10 minutes with this kind of notation, and making Sibelius work for him in mind, which was a feat in its own right. And you can see the YouTube link to, because all our concerts are streamed these days, so that's the YouTube link to the whole concert of 4 live electronic pieces. This is a short excerpt from his work as performed by our live electronics ensemble. Stop there.
Kannst du deinen Ton ausschalten? Oder soll ich meinen Ton ausschalten?
So, and finally, I'm also developing an interactive system for generating this notation from a data format, similar to MIDI, aiming for work with real-time algorithmic notation. So though a prototype, I'm giving this max patch to the 4 composition students this spring in the first year for possible use of new compositions that use this notation for live electronics ensemble. And any useful resources that come out of this project will, of course, be made available for anyone who wants to try. And I found that there are many possible uses for this kind of notation, and one I am interested in exploring further, besides algorithmic composition, is to see how it can benefit timbre-oriented ear training, because that's also a course I'm teaching at Stockholm. And I find that the tools for electroacoustic composition are lacking. So, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yes, great.
Super interesting. Are there any questions? You can just raise your hand. If you go to there's a reactions button in Zoom, and then raise your hand if you have a question. Yes, Andreas.
Just the end was a bit quick. The max, there's a max patch to convert MIDI through your notation, or what was the last slide you showed?
Sorry, yeah, I got a bit pressed for time there. I apologize. Yes, basically for each notational feature and its, let's say, its possible changes, I have something looks like MIDI data that goes with it, and the max patch can already use this kind of MIDI similar data to draw the notation, but I have not implemented the sound yet, but that's on the to-do list.
And is there any object or so we can download from you to use it, or how is it meant for others?
Not yet, because it's too much beta yet, but the moment I think it makes sense to use, I will make it available.
Yes, I'm very interested, and I have a student who is completely in that without knowing you. So I would like to keep in touch about that if you like. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I write some email then. Yeah.
Please do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know, I'm really impressed with this work, and I'm also very interested to talk to you more about it afterwards. I see maybe some connections with some of the work I'm doing as well with the Symbolist project. So I would definitely be interested to talk to you about maybe something with that.
Yeah, I was looking at your SVG paper when I was writing about space for SMC. So yeah, I definitely see similarities, and I think that's the beauty of the tenor. I got so much use for the proceedings for the tenor conferences in my research.
Yeah, great. And I was super impressed to hear the students' realization of the notation as well. It was remarkably, you could, yeah, I mean, it was there. I guess we should probably move on soon, but I was just curious. So I think you kind of answered this question already that I was thinking about was when you're using this notation for your own work, you are realizing it afterwards, but not necessarily, like there's some information that's of course not in the score, right? And so you have to fill in the like especially the spectral density parameters and things like that.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's of course not meant to be the whole truth and nothing but the truth. It's not going to replace the sonogram or anything. But as you say, it's rather. It's hopefully something that can, for example, be a sort of conversation starter in the percussion room, for example. And the percussionist can join in and say, okay, I know what sound we can use, because there's some common ground, and that's what's lacking in the analysis tools we have, because they're always phenomenological. So that's what I like about saying this is actually this broad bandwidth of noise, not something else.
Cool. Well, I think we should probably move on to the next speaker, but thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Great presentation. So next is Joséphine Calandra.
Yes, hello.
Hello. Who will be talking about the multi-scale oracle and automated representation of formal diagrams based on the cognitive algorithm. So if you're ready, you can already share your screen.
So first, I would like to thank the TENOR team for organizing this conference. So I'm Joséphine Calandra, and I will speak for Jean-Marc, Chouvel, Myriam, Desainte-Catherine, and myself to present some work that we did in the context of my PhD thesis at the Research Institute of Musicology in Paris and the Computer Science Research Laboratory of Bordeaux. So I'm here to present you a structure called the multi-scale oracle, and the way we use it to propose an automated representation of formal diagrams. And formal diagrams are computed by what we call the cognitive algorithm. So first, we need to know what is the cognitive algorithm. So it is a system that takes as input and musical representation and gives as output hierarchical formal diagrams. So in the context of my thesis, we focus on the automated analysis of audio files, given a range of parameters that are chosen by the user. So the parameters can be, for example, descriptors that determine what are the similarities we look for, or threshold that determine to what extent we want to discriminate materials in the piece of music. So the cognitive algorithm is the following one. So first, there is a temporal motor that gives a flow of information, and at an instance t, the system acquires an object that represents a piece of information, and each object is processed one by one. So the algorithm first carries out a first test on the object. So the paradigmatic recognition test compares the object that is currently being listened to with previously listened to objects. If the system has never heard this object before, then this object is written in what we call a material memory that stores every new material which appears over time. And it is also saved in what we call the formal memory, which is the memory that stores the object in the time dimension. So if the object is similar to a previously heard object of the same level, it is only recorded in the formal memory. In the incoming knowledge memory, the current object is concatenated with previously heard objects of the same level. We assume here that the system is creating a higher level object. So then comes a second test, which is the syntagmatic recognition test, which validates whether the concatenation of the objects that are obtained since the last segmentation constitute a higher level object or not. So if there is a structuring criterion, then the test is validated and the hypothetical object becomes actually a higher level object. And then the same loop is run again with a new higher level object, which is the concatenation of the objects we just heard since the last structuration. If conversely no segmentation criterion is detected, then the test is invalidated and the algorithm reiterates with the next object of the same level. At a specific level, a formal diagram looks like this. So the ordinate axis represents the materials and the x-axis corresponds to time. We distinguish materials that correspond to a paradigm of a piece of music to objects that are instances of these materials. So depending on the level, the materials can be of different durations. They can be notes, grouping of notes, phrases, or part of a musical piece. And depending on the descriptors, the system can discriminate materials from different characteristics, such as pitch, tone, or other descriptors. So at the beginning of the process, the formal diagram is empty. Here we analyze a piece of music, assuming that each object is encoded by materials that are labeled A, B, A, C, A, B, A, C, D, E, A, B. The first object is heard. It corresponds to a material that is labeled A, and this material has never been heard before. So it is stored in the material memory and a new line is created, and it is also stored in the formal memory, so it is written in the x-axis at a corresponding time t. A new object B is processed also, and it is not similar to A, so it is written in the material and the formal memory. Then A is heard again, so it is not written again in the material memory, and it is also stored in the formal memory in the according line here. So all the information is processed until then there is no object left to parse in the piece of music. So the objective of such representation is to show the music according to people's listening constraints. So it means that we want to represent the creation of a formal diagrams through time. Also, another objective is to propose different representations according to what we define as similar. So therefore, a parameterization of the materials is necessary. Thus, we need to define the similarity criteria between two objects. So these are the criteria that will determine the passing or not of the paradigmatic recognition test. And we also need to determine segmentation criteria that will determine the passing or not of the syntagmatic recognition test. Then this segmentation leads to the grouping of objects that constitute objects of superior level. So there is the necessity to create a structure that stores and connects the object of every levels. So the research that I present to you today are the second of the 3 steps development. So the first step consists of analyzing audio to obtain one unique formal diagram. And the second step, in this step, we assume that we already obtain a character strings from the first analysis. And then we focus on the obtention of hierarchical formal diagrams from a character string. Then the third step consists of linking the 2 first steps to obtain hierarchical formal diagrams from an audio signal. So we presented the first step in a former article. This system takes as input an audio file and parameters such as the similarity threshold and descriptors that we want to compute. And it gives us output one unique formal diagram, and we can see an example of what we obtain here. And the second step is the one we present today and takes as input a character string and parameters such as the structuration and similarity criteria. And we obtain then as output a series of hierarchical formal diagrams. And the third step will be discussed in other studies. So first we needed to implement a data structure that stores the information, and this data structure is a multi-scale oracle. So this structure represents the memory of the algorithm, and it must store various objects and give optimized access to them. And also this structure must represent the links between the objects of a given level with those of higher and lower levels. So for each level of formal diagram, the multi-scale oracle instantiates 5 data structures. The first one is an oracle as it is conceived by Shlomo Debnev, and it is a kind of automaton that allows optimized access to previously heard similar objects. It also instantiates the structure that corresponds to the formal diagram. It instantiates the history next table that stores couples that corresponds to a group of segmented objects with their associated higher level label. And there is the concatenated object that corresponds to the currently listened object that the system concatenates since the last structuring operation. So it constitutes the higher level object under construction. Finally, the links table links the concatenated lower level object to the corresponding upper level object here. So we needed then to define the similarity and the segmentation criteria between character strings. So if we look at the general scheme of the cognitive algorithm, this criteria validates or not the paradigmatic and syntagmatic recognition tests. So for the paradigmatic recognition test, the similarity criterion initially chosen was the strict equality between 2 character strings. For the syntagmatic recognition test, we established 5 different rules. These rules take as input the data structure and the object that is added to this structure, and it returns whether there is a structuring criterion, structuring operation or not before the new added object. So the first rules indicates that there is a structuring operation if an object of the same level is back. The second rule indicates no structuring operation if the new object corresponds to an expected one. So here B is expected as it follows A, which is an object that we already heard before. The third rule indicates a structuring operation if a concatenated object matches an already seen higher level object. So here as AB has already been structured before, then it is structured here. The fourth rule indicates a structuring operation if a concatenated object that has not been structured before is seen again. So the first and the second occurrences here and here are structured. And the fifth rule prevents the structuring operation of an isolated object. So we do not structure here because there is an isolated object. So we applied the algorithm to two musical examples. First example is the Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart Rondo extracted from the piano sonata number 16 in C major. So we started with a pre-analysis by Jean-Marc Chouvel of this rondo on a score at the level of grouping of notes in order to obtain a character string that is this string. And then we provided the string to the system and we selected a set of segmentation rules that are here the 5 rules. Then the algorithm used with the character string is the following one. So we have the character A, which corresponds to what we just heard, that is processed in the system. So it is the first object that is processed. So the first level is created and the system initializes every data structure for this level. This material has never been processed before and it is added to the oracle and the concatenated object. And this object is also added to the material and formal memory of the formal diagram here. A second material, B, is processed and has never been heard before, so the oracle and the concatenated object and the formal diagrams are updated accordingly. Do you hear the music that is playing or not? Okay, thank you. So there is this third object that is very similar to the first one. So in the pre-analysis, it has been given the same level A. So the system acquires an A that is considered to be the same object as the first that has already been heard. So first, the oracle and the formal diagrams are updated accordingly, but also there is here a segmentation criteria as the material A is back. So the concatenated object AB is structured and corresponds to a new higher level object labeled A here. So a higher level is created and every data structure for this higher level is initialized. And the new object A is added to the oracle, to the formal diagram and the concatenated object of this new level. Then a new couple, which is AB and E, is stored to the history next table of the lower level here. And the states 1 and 2 of the links table points to the state 1 of the upper level. As there is no more information at the upper level, we go back to the first level and continue to analyze the incoming objects of this piece of music. So D is heard and the structures are updated accordingly. A is heard again, so there is a structuring operation and we create a new state in the second formal diagram. The concatenated object here, AC, is different to the concatenated object AB, so it's a new material that is added to the second level of the formal diagram. So we keep going. Here there is a new structuring operation, so a new state is added to the second level diagram, which is a material A corresponding to the concatenated object AB. And so there is also a structuring criterion here. So there is a new level that is created and initialized here. Okay, so we process the whole algorithm on the piece. And the final result is this one. And we can see that the third level is similar to a rondo form. We can also pass the song by choosing another set of rules that I have no time to describe here, but we can see that there is a structuring operations here, and so the last diagrams loops here. And we also tested the system on another piece. Here we use number, but it's the exactly same process that is used, and we can see the repetition here of some motifs that led to structuration on upper levels. maybe a non-strict similarity might have given more flexible structuration for this piece. So to conclude, we propose an implementation that allows from a symbolic string to obtain a set of hierarchical formal diagrams. And for this, we implemented similarity and criteria and 5 segmentation rules. We also developed the multi-scale oracle so that stores and browse the object at the different structuring level. And so currently we started actually to implement the transition from the first level formal diagram to obtain a suitable character string. And we also raised the question of a more optimized representation, probably in 3 dimensions, that could superpose the different structuring levels with a given setting, or maybe that could superpose simultaneous analysis with different settings. Also, we are currently integrating the algorithm as a plugin into the software OCS core, which is developed by the Scream. So user might be able to test this one day. And moreover than this integration and this representation might allow applications such as pedagogical resources for musicology students, sound synthesis, or composition. And I thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation, very interesting. I see Georg would like to ask a question. Georg, do you want to ask?
Yeah, thank you, Joséphine, for your beautiful presentation. I was happened to be one of your reviewers. So I had, reviewing your paper already. This one question came to my mind. Whether or not you're familiar with the Schenkerian analysis, because there's a great resemblance in trying to get to the so to speak background of a piece. So have you considered even going a bit further, assuming that you're familiar with Schenkerian analysis, and trying to work out the similarities and the distinctions between your approach?
What do you mean going further with the similarities? You mean finding other similarities rules or other similarity and segmentation criteria? People always refer to Schenkerian analysis as an art, it's not a technology, it's not analysis, it's an art. I think Schenker himself actually called it that way. But anyway, it would be an interesting approach to somehow make a link between a early 20th century approach and something where, in another approach where you use machine learning and machine intelligence to somehow bridge the 2 approaches and see whether there's something in common. As you know, Schenkerian analysis is very popular in some parts of the world and at American universities, particularly in the theory department. It would be nice to also make that link between your approach and Schenkerian analysis, particularly yes, neo-Schenkerian analysis, which of course could also incorporate some of your approaches. Okay, yes, that would be interesting. Maybe to see because also there is a problem of the validation of the results we have. So maybe we can compare at which point it's interesting to put this kind of similarities and to look to compare it with the Schenkerian analysis or other analysis, and to what extent it's bring some new information, or to what extent it's synthesize more of the information, compress more of this information. Yeah.
So basically, if I may add to this, of course, the question is, what conclusions are we going to draw from, these kind of background analyses? What is the exact conclusion? I think it would be also interesting if you could also kind of develop kind of a reverse model, where you start from the background and you work yourself up to the details. So it's kind of interesting. It would be nice to see whether your approach could actually be some sort of a bidirectional one.
Yes.
I'm sorry to cut the conversation short, but I think we have to move forward with the next presentation. But thank you very much for your presentation. And I hope that everyone is on Slack, because we could also, that's a space where we could continue discussing these ideas as well. I was actually also going to ask about, it would be maybe interesting, I don't know if you know the OMAX project at ERCAM, which uses a factor oracle for generation of improvisation, computer improvisation based on factor oracles. Kind of could be interesting for you maybe also. But anyway, thank you again. And with no further ado, I'd like to turn the presentation microphone over to Luca Befera, who will be presenting his paper with Luca Guidrini on the filter and synthesis IT-based approach in the compositive process of Giovanni Verrando and Fausto Romitelli. Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm going to share the screen. Okay, welcome to everyone. We are pleased to be here, and thank you to all the organizational team to setting up this telematic conference. And yes, we are two researchers from the we are going to present the our researches carried out during the past year and before at the University of Pavia. So the present paper shows some computer-ready techniques reversed in the symbolic domain of Giovanni Verrando and Fausto Romitelli, both Italian composers of the 60th generation who studied at ERCAM after a parallel training in Italy. Referring to what already done by the spectral composers of the previous generations, they develop a specific IT-based approach and expressive means. ERCAM software, sound conception in spectral terms, and psychoacoustics influences result as essential to define their production, according to a technomorphic process. The score analysis of Triptych for Large Orchestra and Electronics by Verrando and Hallucination 1 Drowning Girl by Romitelli, the third movement of an index of metals for soprano, ensemble, electronics, and video, highlights these aspects. As discussed below, the score derives from a specific usage of filtering and synthesis techniques to trace the score, respectively linked to a pre-compositive process based on recording material or defined formulas. The composer's perspectives emerge as complementary. In Triptych, filtering is a useful tool to manage the spectral content, while synthesis is a means for sounds production. In an index of metals, filtering is a tool used in the production of the electronics, whereas synthesis is a model to rent the spectral content. So the analysis of digital or handwritten sketches underlines a cyclical conception founded on discrete units, clearly perceptible as segmented blocks or concealed in favor of a continuous process. Each approach reflects electronic dynamics and software processing relevance, rendered on the score through a canonical notation. The synthesized and reorchestrated sounds of Triptych come from 38 predetermined samples, analyzed or resynthesized with AudioSCAT, and then arranged on a max MSP patch connected to the keyboard MIDI notes. The analog instrument continuously plays, mirroring the acoustical outcomes in the background or reproducing electronic sounds in the foreground. The composer models or selects the spectral components of defined samples taken from other pieces or previously generated through digital synthesis. The continuous comparison between the sonogram graphics rendering and the acoustic analog outcome shapes the desired sonic result. Therefore, the parallel definition of digital samples, extended techniques, and handmade instruments progressively bring to the score notation. This process implies a close relationship between electronic and acoustic dynamics. To clarify this dichotomy, Eric Maestri defines the categories of exogenous and endogenous movements. The former related to instrumental music and a gesture-carried sound, the latter referring to electronic music and texture-carried sound modifiable within itself. The essential difference lies in the evolution of the envelope sustain. These concepts describe triptych macro tendencies generally expressed in friction or convergence of these categories toward hybrid sonic results. Moreover, Verrando manages all the sonic material according to enharmonic, aperiodic, harmonic, or sinusoidal sounds. These spectral contents refer to psychoacoustics perceptive rules studied at IRCAM. Therefore, it segregates auditory streams depending on sound qualities and, consequently, on their relationships. AudioSculpt allows precisely to shape, merge, or separate the sound's spectral content towards different notational outcomes. For example, waving oscillations within the sound enharmonic texture characterize sound 31. Besides the keyboard pitch pressing duration, the score does not report anything else. The composer also uses AudioSculpt for the spectral analysis of pre-existing samples. The top left sonogram refers to an excerpt from Razait, the 16th track of the album Alto Piri by Pansonic. Observing and listening, the composer achieves the most similar sonic result by using cymbals rubbed against each other with a circular motion. The resulting adiasematic notation on bottom indicates the gesture durations and percussive accents in red squares, whereas word-written instructions and icons explain the sound quality and playing techniques. Finally, he applies another instrumental synthesis. Starting from the additive synthesis of sinusoidal sounds loaded and played in the sampler on bottom left, the composer generates a harmonic aggregate then rendered through the orchestra and represented in diastematic notation. Therefore, these are not sinusoidal but complex timbres, whose perceptual result tends to be harmonic. The resulting sounds are then assembled and repeated within the piece as separated blocks or simultaneous streams. Each kind of notation aims to translate a specific timbral category through diastematic or adiastematic notation or words explaining gestures. The peculiar sonic result focused on the spectral implications is mainly generated by the materiality of non-conventional objects and the extending instrumental techniques derived, above all, from the endogenous electronic content at the very basis of the piece.
Since his first approach with the IRCAM courses in 1991, Romitelli introduces computer-aided composition knowledge in his practice. With the help of Laurent Potier, he developed a personal patchwork library, used for the pieces written in the 90s. In the 2000s, Romitelli started to work with the open music language, mainly to create and organize fixed harmonic fields in a personal compositional discourse. Unlike Giovanni Verrando's case, Romitelli does not start from a pre-existent spectrum in order to resynthesize the exact auditory image, but rather from a sound synthesis criterion that symbolically, thanks to patchwork and then thanks to open music, generates pitches aggregates of imaginary complex spectra to be orchestrated. The actual state of research does not permit to examine Fausto Romitelli's personal computer, preserved by the Giorgio Cini Foundation in Venice. However, the sketches-driven analysis permits to investigate the symbolic synthesis process that allows him to create the formal and pitch organization of Hallucination 1 Drawninger, the third section of an index of metals. Currently preserved by the Giorgio Cini Foundation in Venice, the sources analyzed for this research were conserved in a mixed folder that contains sources related to an index of metals, Domenica e la periferia dell'impero, and Seascape, and not for lessons. Those sources consist in A, 3 pages of annotations, schemes, and tables for the control of time, density, and dynamics. B, 3 double-sided pages of sketches with references to A and C. And C, 1 glossed page of an article by Barry Troe, the famous organizational technique for C-to-M ratios in frequency modulation. For time reason, we will skip directly to the analysis of the sources B and C, the most important regarding the instrumental synthesis level. Source B consists of a double-sided bifolio and a single double-sided page. It contains a scheme with 150 bars of bit aggregates, with numerical references to A and C, some orchestration indications, textual references to the soprano part, and harmonic references to the guitar, bass, and keyboard part. 2 details of the sketch explain the genetic criteria of those aggregates. A box with the indication FM1 and the ratios written above every aggregate. D1 indicates the nominal and hidden through the process frequency of a frequency modulation, whose ratios are expressed over every aggregate.
Sorry, there's someone with the microphone open. I can't hear very well.
Okay. Can everyone please make sure that their microphones are muted? Thank you.
Okay. Frequency modulation was used in the so-called instrumental synthesis since Murray's Gondwana as a static technomorphic metaphor useful to create complex sounds. In the case of Hallucination 1 Drowning Girl, FM assumes structural relevance, since the organization of the pitch aggregates is driven by the process explained in this table. Starting from that and from pitch aggregates in source B, it was possible to recreate on Max 8 using Bach and Cage libraries, especially the object Cage FM, the open music patch used to create the symbolic FM from the fundamental frequency and the ratios between the carrier and modulation frequency, with a fixed modulation index of 1. The patch operates with an approximation of semitones, meaning that the principle behind the instrumental synthesis of Romitelli is not the aural accuracy of a timbre, but the creation of interesting hearing and processional-driven group of fixed harmonic fields. In the picture, it's possible to see how those harmonic fields are embedded in the time structure of the sketch A, and its consequential realization on the score. In conclusion, although based on different assumptions, the two analyses demonstrate the influence in writing and notation of a computer-aided compositional approach. The composers, coming from a similar background where the practices studied at IRCAM assume great importance, move towards the specific examination discussed before. The software usage strictly connected to a spectral approach is implemented towards specific modalities of sound generation and control of the formal organization. The use of filtering and synthesis processes is emblematic of these dynamics, as practical application of abstract information models and technomorphic tendencies. The musical language becomes more and more permeated by digital contaminations, both at structural and computer-aided processes level, as fundamental elements in the composer poetics. Thank you.
Great, thank you both. That was great. Are there any questions from the attendees? Let me check the, okay, nothing there. Anybody like to ask a question? I have a question if no one else does. I am seeing, and I think this is bringing up a nice point, which is that the compositional tools that composers use often are really having a big influence over how they compose. And so that's, I'm happy to see this coming up in conversation. And I'm curious whether are you seeing also in like more recently, if there are new tools that you've noticed that are having a strong impact on more recent compositions?
I can ask, maybe I can answer, maybe. Yes. So those are, of course, some historic examples of using some software already developed and maybe old softwares, you know, maybe also AudioSCAP doesn't work in the most recent Macs, so we are dealing with old, maybe old softwares. Today, of course, both the knowledge of the composers of the informatic tools and both the this kind of fixation of the experimental practice of the 80s and the 90s have made a kind of development of those software, creating some personal one. For instance, one example that I can bring is also Daniele Gysi, who's has developed his own with Andrea Agostini, his own Bach, Encage and Dada library, and he uses these those libraries for his personal compositional approach. So there is a kind of continuation of these tendencies in I think today in the everyday practice of the composers who work with, I don't know, Super Collider, Max and other languages. They made their software to help them to compose. So I hope I have answered to your question.
Yes, of course, it's a deep topic that we can't possibly get to the end of in this short time. But yeah, I think also I think tonight's keynote, Thor Magnusson, will probably be addressing some of these ideas as well, who's very interesting researcher on sort of instrumental and compositional, the way instruments and composing systems kind of come together.
Yeah, maybe I can add something. Oh no, we have no time, sorry.
Oh, sorry, yes, we should continue, yes. But if you had just a quick... I didn't mean to cut you off.
Just something. I think that this kind of discretization between this kind of blocks organization and streams is something very, as I totally agree with Luca, it's something very old-fashioned in a way. But of course, it's a way of thinking, and so maybe we can find some connections with this kind of compositional approach, but maybe in a subtler way. So that's my opinion generally.
Great, thank you.